So welcome to this segment of my mathematics videos as I guide you through a topic we are calling as being numbers. So I want you to understand, numbers in mathematics, because these numbers, you are going to be using them in almost all the topics that you are going to be dealing with. So once you understand the numbers, it will be easier for you to actually carry out calculations later on. So there are a lot of numbers that you need to understand. For example, you need to understand that we do have what we call as being natural numbers. Natural numbers sometimes are called as being counting numbers. So they are cardinal numbers, counting numbers. And normally the symbol that we use to represent natural numbers, we use a symbol that looks like an N. And if I was to give you an example of natural numbers, we can put them in curly brackets. Like I said, they are counting numbers, very important numbers, and starts from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can go on and so on and so forth. So the dotted line there simply means so on and so forth, meaning that the numbers can go up to forever. That is what we mean. So those are what we simply call as being counting numbers. So from 1 to wherever the numbers may end, or up to forever, that is what we call as being natural numbers. The other type of numbers that you need to know are what we simply call as being whole numbers. So when we talk about whole numbers, these are natural numbers with 0 included. So we can simply talk about natural numbers. So we are talking about natural numbers with 0 included. So when you get the natural numbers and include 0, those are what we are simply calling as being whole numbers. And basically whole numbers can be represented by a symbol that looks like a W there. So if I was to list down whole numbers, you start from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. That is what we mean. The other type of numbers that you need to become familiar with is what we call as being, integers. So you need to remember integers. So integers are represented by a symbol that looks like a Z, if you're able to see from there, but of course it looks like a symbol that looks like a Z. So for integers, we are simply talking about, both positive and negative whole numbers. That is what we can say. So both positive and negative whole numbers, those are what we are simply calling as being integers. Or if you want, you can simply say, integers are counting numbers, and also 0 and negative whole numbers. So what we mean is that if I was to give you, an example of integers, you could have some numbers, maybe that you have this side, and probably we can start maybe from -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. The numbers can keep on going. So you can see you have both negative, including 0, and you also have positive integers. So if you look at these ones, these are negative numbers, these are positive numbers, but we have also included 0. So they form up what we simply call as being integers. So you shouldn't forget the number line, is going to help you appreciate that. The other type of numbers that you need to come across is what we call as being, let me start with, even numbers. What exactly are even numbers? Well, when we talk about even numbers, these are numbers that are divisible by 2. In other words, 2 can go into them. So we are simply talking about, numbers divisible. When I use the word divisible, meaning they can be divided. Divisible numbers, divisible by 2. So that is what we simply call as being, even numbers. So when we talk about, even numbers, when you divide them by 2, they do not leave any remainder. That is what we call as being even numbers. So if you were to list, a set of even numbers, if I was to list a set of even numbers, we can simply say the numbers starting from 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on and so forth. That is what we mean. So remember, 0 is simply an even number, because when you divide by 2, definitely a 2 can go there, which is going to give you 0 divided by 2. If you notice, it will give you a 0. So 0 is simply considered to be an even number. Another one that you need to remember when it comes to these numbers, apart from even numbers, we need to talk about what we call as being odd numbers. Now, what exactly are odd numbers? Well, an odd number is a number that leaves a remainder, a number that leaves a remainder 1 when divided by 2. So a number which when you divide by 2, it gives you a remainder 1. That is what we call as being an odd number. Examples of odd numbers that we do have, which when we divide by 2 to leave a remainder 1. Yes, 1 is actually an odd number. So you have 1, a 3, because when you divide that, we also have a 5, we also have a 7, we also have a 9, and so on and so forth. That's what we mean. Remember, 1 is simply an odd number, a number which when divided by 2 leaves a remainder 1. Or if you want, you can say it's an integer which cannot be divided by 2 without leaving a remainder. So that is what we call as being odd numbers. But there are some more numbers that we need to become familiar with, introducing you to the world of mathematics, which you need to become familiar with because you are going to be using these ones. Another one that we can simply talk about there, I think that should be the 6th one, is what we call as being prime numbers. So what exactly are prime numbers? Well, when we talk about prime numbers, these are numbers that are precisely divisible by 1 and itself. That's what we can say. I can simply say number, that is precisely a number that is precisely divisible by 1 and itself. That's what we mean. So in other words, there are only two factors, the number 1 and the number itself. So those are what we simply call as being prime numbers. Now, examples of prime numbers, if I was told you to list an example of prime numbers that we do have, well, prime numbers include a 2, a 3, a 5, a 7, 11. You can talk about 13, 17, 19, and so on and so forth. That's what we mean. Now, I want you to understand something when it comes to that. Let me give you a tip there. We are going to call it as being a golden tip. So if you look at prime numbers, two things that you need to remember. 1 is not a prime number. So 1 is not a prime number. That is what you need to remember. Then 2, you need to know that 2, the number 2 that we have, is the only, even prime number that we do have. So 2 is the only even prime number that we have. So that is what you need to remember. Of course, numbers go on. If I was to look at number 7, I can talk about what we call as being irrational numbers. So when we talk about irrational numbers, in most cases we may use a symbol that may look like a Q there. So let me start with maybe what we are calling as being maybe rational numbers, so that I can just help you to to appreciate that. So we can simply say rational numbers. Now, when we talk about rational numbers, these are simply numbers which can be written, or that can be expressed as a fraction. That's what we can say. In other words, we are talking about numbers that can be written numbers that can be written in the form, a over b, but of course where a and b are integers. Now of course I want you to understand in this case that b should not be equal to 0. So the one at the bottom, when you write it a over b, this b here, the b there should not be equal to 0. Otherwise it would not qualify to be called a rational number. In other words, rational numbers, you are able to express them as fractions. That is what you need to remember. So that is what we call as being rational numbers. Now suppose I told you to give examples of rational numbers that we do have. Well, there are a lot of rational numbers that you can talk about. For example, negative 2.5. I can talk about maybe 0.3, especially if the number is a recurring one. Let me just shift that one. When I put a bar on top, it simply means the number is recurring. It repeats itself. What I mean, for example, if you say, 3 divided by 10, if you're able to see on the calculator there, 3 divided by 10, or sorry, rather 1 divided by, by 3, 1 divided by 3 to give you 0.333. So the 3 is a recurring one. So because 3 repeats itself, we can just write as 0.3, the number that repeats itself, then you write a bar there. All these are what we simply call as being, rational numbers. Numbers that can be written as, fractions like that, 1 over 11. You can also talk about 4 over 1. That is still what we are calling as being a rational number. As long as you are able to write it or to express it as a fraction, then we are referring to it as being a rational number. 5 over 2, that is a rational number, and so on and so forth. All right, hopefully you're together. The other type of numbers that you need to appreciate, the other type of numbers that you need to appreciate is okay, I've lost track of what I was doing there, so possibly that should be 8 if I'm not mistaken, what we are calling as being irrational numbers. So irrational numbers. Now what exactly are irrational numbers? Well, irrational numbers, are numbers, we can simply say are numbers, that cannot be expressed as a fraction. So those numbers that cannot be expressed as fraction, or if you want, you can simply say, if you want, that numbers, you can simply say numbers that are not rational. So those numbers that are not rational, those are what we call as being irrational numbers. So that is what you need to remember. Now, if I was to give you examples of, irrational numbers, the most famous irrational number that we have written by its Greek alphabet is this symbol here. And usually we call it as being, pi. So that is what we call as being, pi. So this number pi is simply an, irrational number. You cannot express it more like as a fraction. In other words, you'll be able to see that it is non-terminating. In other words, it is not recurring. If you were to type pi on your calculator, the number will go on and it will not be repeating. Let me just demonstrate that to you so that you are able to see. So if you're able to see, there's no number that is actually repeating itself. It is non-recurring. Therefore, it is an irrational number. Of course, we can talk about maybe things like, the square root of 2. With that can also be what we are calling as being, an irrational number. That is possible. The square root of maybe 51. In other words, the square roots of those numbers that are not perfect square, those are what we simply call as being irrational numbers. Now, all these numbers that we have talked about, let me just summarize for you. All these numbers fall under the realm of what we call as being real numbers. And usually real numbers is represented by a symbol that looks like R. So those we have talked about, if you're able to remember, integers, we talked about natural numbers, we talked about whole numbers, we have talked about integers, natural numbers, whole numbers. We have talked about odd numbers. We have talked about even numbers. We have talked about prime numbers. We have talked about irrational numbers. We have talked about rational numbers. All these numbers that we have actually talked about, put them together, they make up what we call real numbers. So you need to remember such concepts. So that is what we call as being real numbers. Right, so now my last concept that I want to bring to your attention, there are a lot of numbers that can come from these, and among them we can talk about what we call as being square. Sometimes you are going to be finding square numbers. Now square numbers, when we talk about square numbers, these are numbers that can be written in the form n raised to the power 2. So if you're able to write a number as n raised to the power 2, then we call it as being a square number. For example, 1 raised to the power 2, 2 raised to the power 2, 3 raised to the power 2, 4 raised to the power 2, 5 raised to the power 2, 6 raised to the power 2, 7 raised to the power 2, 8 raised to the power 2, 9 raised to the power 2, and so on. Now what is 1 raised to the power 2? It is 1. 2 raised to the power 2, 4. 3 raised to the power 2, 9. That one, 16. 5 raised to the power 2, 25. 6 raised to the power 2, 36. 7 raised to the power 2, 49. 8 raised to the power 2, 64. And 9 raised to the power 2, that is 81. So these numbers that you're able to see at the bottom here, these are what we call as being square numbers. Why? Because all these numbers can be written in that form, and that is what we simply call as being square numbers. Please watch out for more so that I can show you how to go about it. I hope you enjoyed my video, and please, you need to go back so that you understand these numbers. Thank you.